I went to fix her sink, but the real leak was my heart. It started with a small, seemingly mundane task, fixing a leaky sink in an apartment tucked between the bustle of the city streets. I wasn't expecting much. A routine job, a few wrenches, a little elbow grease. Yet, as soon as I stepped inside her apartment, I realized this wasn't going to be ordinary. The door opened before I could knock properly, and there she was, poised, confident, and radiant in a way that made the air feel warmer, though the sunlight spilling through the blinds was already doing its job. She must have been in her early 40s, yet her presence carried an effortless grace, the kind that comes from living fully and knowing exactly who you are. My own nerves were suddenly louder than the drip of the sink I had come to fix. "Hello?" she said, her voice soft yet firm, carrying a hint of amusement. I caught the subtle arch of her brow, and I realized instantly that she noticed more than I wanted her to: my awkward shuffle, the grease-stained shirt, and probably the way I tried too hard to appear competent. I introduced myself, fumbling slightly as I carried my toolbox into her kitchen. Our hands brushed as I passed her the wrench, and for a split second, I felt the warmth of her skin, the quiet steadiness in the touch. My heartbeat betrayed me, and I cursed the irony of a plumbing job making me this aware of someone else's presence. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gave me a small smile, enough to disarm me further. Her apartment smelled faintly of lavender and fresh coffee, and the light dancing across the room softened her features: high cheekbones, eyes that seemed to hold a mixture of humor and quiet reflection. I tried to focus on the sink, reminding myself that my hands were here to fix a leak, not get distracted by the woman standing a few feet away. I crouched under the sink, muttering apologies for the inevitable clatter of pipes, and she leaned slightly, watching my every movement. When she asked a question about the old faucet, her hand lightly touched my shoulder as she pointed, a gentle, fleeting connection that sent a shiver up my spine. I noticed the faint perfume she wore, the warmth radiating from her skin, and the soft way she shifted her weight, unconsciously drawing me into her orbit. We exchanged small jokes about my inexperience, and I could hear the laughter in her voice, subtle but genuine, echoing in the room. There was something disarming about her presence, confident yet quietly vulnerable, self-assured yet somehow seeking connection. And as I tightened the last bolt, I realized the leak I had come to fix might be the only thing tangible here, because the rest of me felt strangely exposed, aware, and undeniably drawn to her. By the time I packed up my tools, the air between us had shifted imperceptibly. The sink was fixed, the pipes no longer dripping, but in its place lingered something unspoken: curiosity, tension, and a spark I couldn't ignore. A simple plumbing job had become the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for, yet couldn't resist exploring. After the initial handshake and awkward smiles, the real work began, though it quickly became clear that this job was about more than tightening bolts and sealing pipes. As I knelt under the sink, her presence hovered nearby, just close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, yet far enough to keep our interactions deliberately careful. She asked questions about the tools I was using, leaning over slightly, her shoulder brushing against mine as she pointed to a stubborn pipe. That touch, light as it was, sent an unexpected jolt up my arm, leaving me acutely aware of every movement, every breath. I tried to focus on my task, adjusting the wrench with hands that suddenly felt clumsy and exposed. Her voice carried a quiet curiosity, a gentle lilt that made even mundane questions feel intimate. "Are you sure that's tight enough?" she asked, her eyes bright and observing, lips curved in a teasing half-smile. I nodded, fumbling a little as I tightened the joint, and she chuckled softly, a sound that lingered longer than the echo of the pipes. We fell into an easy rhythm. I worked, she watched, occasionally reaching over to adjust a loose tool or point out something I had missed. Each accidental brush of her fingers along my forearm, each subtle lean, made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the plumbing. The smell of metal and cleaning solution mixed with the faint fragrance she wore, grounding me in the moment, while simultaneously pulling my attention entirely toward her. At one point, she crouched beside me to inspect a tricky corner, her knee brushing against mine. Our eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world shrank to that small, sunlit kitchen. I noticed the way her hair fell across her face, the warmth in her gaze, the slight smile that hinted at amusement and understanding. It was disarming, the way she balanced confidence with vulnerability, the way she could make a simple task feel weighty with unspoken emotion. I made a joke about my supposed expertise, and she laughed, the sound low and genuine, vibrating against the quiet room. Her laughter seemed to reach into some corner of me I didn't realize existed, a mixture of nervous excitement and sudden comfort. I realized I was paying attention to everything, the tilt of her head, the cadence of her words, the soft brush of her hand when she adjusted the wrench I had dropped. By the time I finished the final adjustment, the sink itself was no longer dripping, perfectly functional. Yet there was a different kind of leak I couldn't fix, the slow, imperceptible trickle of something unspoken between us. A shared glance lingered longer than necessary, a touch that lasted an extra heartbeat, and a quiet, mutual acknowledgement that neither of us wanted the moment to end. As I packed up my tools, I caught her looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and something warmer, something heavier. The physical work was done, yet the emotional labor had just begun. In that brief hour, a connection had formed that neither plumbing nor small talk could contain, and I left her apartment with the faintest ache in my chest, aware that I was already drawn in, unable to ignore the quiet pull between us. By the time the sink was fully fixed and the tools tucked away, she surprised me by gesturing toward a small, sunlit corner of her kitchen. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, her tone casual yet inviting. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, caught off guard by the offer, but nodded. There was something in her smile that made declining impossible, a quiet warmth, a subtle gravity that drew me in. We sat across from each other at her small table, the morning light spilling over worn wooden surfaces. She poured coffee into delicate porcelain cups, the rich aroma filling the room, mingling with the faint scent of her perfume. Steam curled from the cup, and as I wrapped my hands around it, I felt a little steadiness seep into my own nerves. Yet, even with the warmth in my palms, my attention kept drifting to her, the way her fingers lingered on the handle, the soft tilt of her head as she regarded me. Our conversation began cautiously, sharing small talk about the weather, the building, and the challenges of city life. But soon, it drifted into deeper waters. She spoke about her work, her routines, and the subtle regrets that sometimes lingered in her reflections. I found myself listening intently, hanging on to her every word, fascinated not just by her stories but by the way she told them, with a mixture of humor, grace, and quiet vulnerability. When it was my turn, I shared my own experiences, the small victories, the struggles, the ambitions that sometimes felt too big for my 20-something years. She leaned slightly forward, eyes bright with interest, occasionally resting a hand lightly near mine on the table as she laughed at my anecdotes. That touch, though casual, made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't expecting. It was grounding, intimate, and startlingly simple all at once. There were pauses between sentences, moments where our eyes met and held longer than necessary. In those silences, I felt the unspoken tension grow, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and something quieter, something almost forbidden. I noticed the subtle way she sipped her coffee, the way her lips curved when she smiled, and the flicker of something unsaid in her gaze. It was in these quiet exchanges that I began to understand the age difference not as a barrier, but as a layer of perspective. Her experiences, her measured patience, and the gentle confidence in her voice contrasted sharply with my own youthful impulsiveness. And yet, rather than intimidating me, it made me more aware of her humanity, her fragility beneath the poised exterior, and the comfort she offered simply by being present. By the time the cups were empty, I realized that something in me had shifted. The sink might have been the reason I came to her apartment, but the real connection had formed over coffee, conversation, and those subtle touches that lingered longer than they should. I left that morning with the sound of her laughter still echoing in my mind, and the quiet knowledge that this was only the beginning of something that neither of us fully understood yet, but both were undeniably drawn toward. A few days had passed since the sink was fixed, yet the memory of that morning lingered in my mind like a quiet hum. I hadn't expected to return so soon, but when she called about a small drip she thought might have been missed, I found myself willingly heading back, toolbox in hand, nerves buzzing in anticipation. This time, the atmosphere felt different, softer, charged with an unspoken familiarity. She greeted me at the door with that same poised smile, but there was a subtle warmth in her eyes, a quiet invitation that made me aware of every inch between us. We exchanged casual conversation as I moved toward the sink, but the words were secondary to the small, lingering glances and the way our bodies occasionally brushed. The first moment it happened, truly happened, was during the cleanup. A small spill of water on the counter prompted her to reach over, her hand brushing mine as she guided a damp cloth. It was fleeting, just a whisper of contact, yet it sent an unexpected jolt through me. I felt the warmth of her skin, the softness of her fingers, and the electric thrill of proximity that had nothing to do with plumbing. My chest tightened, and I realized I had been unconsciously holding my breath. Her eyes met mine, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and for a heartbeat, we simply existed in that shared moment. No words, no explanations, just the quiet recognition of connection. She pulled back ever so slightly, but not fully, letting the moment linger in the charged space between us. I found myself acutely aware of every detail, the subtle sway of her hair as she moved, the warmth radiating from her shoulders, and the soft scent of her perfume mingling with the faint smell of damp wood and metal. We worked in tandem on the small task at hand, passing tools and wiping surfaces, but now there was an added layer of awareness. Every accidental brush, every brief touch, felt heavier with meaning. When she leaned close to inspect a tricky corner, our knees nudged each other under the counter, and I felt a quiet jolt of both excitement and hesitation. I wanted to prolong the contact without overstepping, to honor the delicate boundary while savoring the closeness. The conversation that accompanied the work was lighter, but the intimacy had shifted. Her laughter carried a subtle undertone of flirtation, and I caught glimpses of vulnerability in the way she occasionally glanced at me, as if weighing what she could reveal. I noticed, too, the small hesitations in my own movements, the careful attention to proximity, and the growing awareness that this was no longer a simple job. It was a dance of emotion, slowly building with every shared glance and touch. By the time I finished, I realized that the sink was just a pretext. The true work had been the slow, deliberate weaving of connection. She had left me both exhilarated and unsettled, aware of the depth of attraction forming between us, yet careful not to rush it. The first meaningful touch had passed, leaving a lingering warmth, a quiet ache, and the unmistakable promise of something far more profound than either of us dared to voice. It had been another week since I'd fixed the sink, yet her presence lingered in my mind in a way that felt almost intrusive. When she invited me over to help with a minor shelf installation, I found myself stepping into her apartment with a mix of anticipation and unease, unsure whether I was walking into a casual favor or something far more intimate. This time, the task itself seemed secondary. We moved around the apartment in quiet coordination, passing tools and instructions with the ease of familiarity, yet there was an unspoken gravity to every glance, every brush of hands. The afternoon sun filtered through her curtains, casting a warm, golden light that seemed to soften the edges of the room, and of our guarded hearts. When the installation was complete, she suggested we sit down in the living room. The air felt different now, heavier, more expectant. She settled onto the couch, inviting me to sit beside her. The simple act of sitting close brought a subtle charge, our knees lightly touching, her hand resting near mine on the armrest. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, the soft brush of her sleeve against my forearm, and my chest tightened in response. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice softer than usual, tinged with something vulnerable. "About everything. About mistakes, about regrets, about walls we build around ourselves." Her gaze didn't waver, though I could see the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. I listened intently, aware that whatever she was about to share was significant. She took a slow breath, her hand moving closer to mine, brushing my fingers almost casually. "The leak you fixed in the kitchen," she said with a small, wry smile, "wasn't the only one. The real leak has been me." Her words struck me, simple yet layered. It wasn't a playful metaphor this time, it was a confession of vulnerability. I felt the weight of it in my chest, a mixture of protectiveness, longing, and awe. I reached out, gently covering her hand with mine, feeling the steadiness beneath her quiet tremor. She looked at me, eyes soft and unguarded, and for a moment, words weren't necessary. The room was filled with the warmth of afternoon light, the faint scent of her perfume, and the subtle rhythm of our breathing. Every small movement, the tilt of her head, the brush of her hair, the lingering touch of her fingers against mine, spoke volumes. I wanted to say something profound, to assure her that she wasn't alone, that her walls could be shared and softened. But instead, I stayed present, letting the moment exist in its fragile, electric intensity. There was tension, yes, a quiet, pressing awareness of the age gap, of societal expectations, of all the reasons to hesitate, yet none of it diminished the undeniable pull between us. When she leaned back slightly, resting her shoulder near mine, I realized that the confession had shifted something irreversibly. The real leak wasn't a flaw to fix, it was an opening, a space of trust, an invitation to something deeper. And as I glanced at her, the soft vulnerability in her eyes mirrored my own, a silent acknowledgement that what had begun as a simple repair had become the slow, careful construction of intimacy either of us had expected. It was one of those evenings that felt suspended in time, quiet, warm, and intimate. She had invited me over under the pretense of helping with organizing some old books, but by the moment I arrived, it was clear that the task itself was secondary. The city outside was fading into dusk, the soft hum of traffic barely audible through her partially open windows, and the apartment was bathed in a golden glow from the low-hanging lights she had chosen with care. We moved around her living room in gentle rhythm, picking up books, arranging them on shelves, and occasionally passing each other a volume or a small trinket. Each touch was deliberate yet casual, a hand brushing mine as I handed her a heavy book, a subtle lean when she reached for a shelf just above my shoulder. There was electricity in these small, accidental contacts, an awareness that both of us felt but neither dared to name aloud. After a while, she suggested we take a break. She poured 2 glasses of wine and led me to a small sofa by the window. The evening light slanted across the room, illuminating her face in a way that made her appear almost ethereal, confident, graceful, yet with a quiet vulnerability that drew me closer than I expected. I felt my chest tighten as she set the glass in my hand, our fingers brushing briefly, and I realized how much I had been craving proximity to her. We talked quietly, not about work, not about errands, but about life, small confessions, shared memories, and fleeting thoughts that we hadn't yet revealed. Her voice was calm, steady, yet there were moments when a crack of vulnerability shone through, making her all the more real and human. I noticed the soft curve of her smile as she laughed at a story I told, the way her eyes softened when she paused to listen, and the subtle lean of her shoulder against mine as if seeking comfort in the silence. The physical closeness was measured, natural, and intimate without being overwhelming. Her head occasionally tilted toward my shoulder, our knees brushed lightly, and when I absent-mindedly tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, she let me, leaning just slightly into the gesture. Each moment carried warmth, a quiet intimacy that felt both safe and exhilarating, a delicate dance of emotional connection and non-sexual touch. I became acutely aware of the sensory world around me, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the subtle aroma of her candles, the softness of her sweater against my fingers, the gentle weight of her presence beside me. Every shared glance and lingering smile deepened the unspoken understanding between us, that what had begun as a simple plumbing job had evolved into something far more profound, tender, and human. By the time I left that night, I carried with me a sense of quiet contentment, an awareness of a bond slowly forming that was built on trust, subtle affection, and emotional honesty. The tension that had hovered in earlier encounters had softened into a warm intimacy, a promise that the leak between us was no longer something to fix, but something to nurture, a connection that neither age nor circumstance could diminish. The weeks that followed felt like a gentle unfolding, each encounter building on the last, each moment steeped in quiet understanding. When I arrived at her apartment this time, It was neither under the guise of repairs nor tasks. I carried nothing but myself and the curiosity that had grown into something unshakable. The city outside hummed softly, a distant, comforting presence, while the apartment welcomed me with the warm, familiar light that now seemed to mirror her own aura, steady, inviting, alive. She greeted me with a smile that was both playful and knowing, the kind that made my chest tighten in a familiar, satisfying way. We moved through the apartment with a relaxed rhythm, unpacking groceries or tidying small things, the work itself becoming secondary to the shared space between us. Every brush of our hands, every subtle glance, carried the weight of the connection we had been nurturing quietly over time. Eventually, we settled on the sofa, the city's glow filtering through the blinds. I noticed how comfortable it felt just to exist near her, to share silences that were rich with unspoken understanding. She leaned against me, her head resting lightly on my shoulder, and I felt the warmth of her presence settle into me as naturally as sunlight warming skin. Our fingers intertwined almost instinctively, the touch deliberate yet effortless, a testament to the intimacy that had grown from our cautious, slow-burn encounters. We laughed about the earlier awkward moments, the dripping sink, my clumsy attempts at repairs, and the small missteps that had seemed monumental at the time. Her laughter was soft, melodic, and somehow grounding, carrying the subtle undertone of trust and mutual affection. It was in these moments that the age difference no longer felt like a question or a complication. It simply became another layer of the human story we were writing together. She reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair from my forehead, her touch lingering just long enough to make my heart beat a little faster. I responded instinctively, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple, a simple, respectful gesture that spoke volumes. The moment was intimate without words, full of shared recognition and quiet reassurance. The real leak, she had once said, was not something to fix but something to honor, and now it was clear, we had found a way to mend the gaps between us with patience, care, and honesty. As the evening deepened, we remained close, hands intertwined, bodies gently pressed in the comfort of each other's presence. There was no need for dramatic declarations or rushed confessions. The emotional arc that had begun with a small plumbing task had arrived at a satisfying equilibrium. Trust had been built, attraction acknowledged, and hearts quietly, irrevocably connected. When I finally left, the world outside seemed both familiar and subtly transformed. I carried with me the warmth of her touch, the softness of her gaze, and the quiet knowledge that our connection, born from something as ordinary as fixing a sink, had become extraordinary in the most human, deeply felt way. The story had come full circle, the leak repaired, and what remained was not just love, but a profound emotional intimacy that neither age nor circumstance could diminish. If this story of unexpected connection and slow-burn romance touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of heartfelt stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever felt a connection that surprised you in the most ordinary moment?